What's up, guys? It's almost Halloween, and I wanted to do a quick little video discussing the archetype of what I feel is one of the most misrepresented, misunderstood, and over exaggerated archetypes. And that is the archetype of the witch. Whether you identify as a witch yourself, because I do know that there are women who identify as being witches, or if you're someone who's just interested in history and you just love learning about history, I think that you're gonna get something valuable from this video. When I say the word witch, what comes to your mind? I want you to take note of the things that come to your mind when you think of or you hear the word witch. I'm assuming you're probably thinking of someone who wears all black, someone who is quite mysterious, is maybe a little bit of an outcast or a loner, someone who casts spells or manipulates, someone who does love magic. There are a lot of things that come to mind. Evil, manipulative, those are words that frequently come to mind when we think of the word witch. And I was conditioned through my personal life to believe those things as well. A few years ago, I took a class at University of Tampa, and the class was a humanity. I took it because I needed to fulfill my humanities requirement for my undergraduate. And the class in question was the history of witchcraft. And I was instantly curious about this about this class because I've never seen a class like that. And I'm so happy that I took that class because it opened the door for me for so much more consideration and so much more um, reflection in my own personal life. This video is not going to be super exhaustive, by the way, but I do want to go back, and this is just going to serve as starting the conversation. What we call in present day witches have their origins thousands of years ago. So, the archetype of the women that we call witches in our time, thousands of years ago, held the title of midwife or priestess or advisor, oracle, sage. Those are the women that were the advisors to great leaders, whether they were tribe leaders in ancient Mesopotamia or priestesses in Egypt. These women, what they all have in common is there is some type of sacred knowledge there. They are settled into their feminine energies. They work with nature. They're able to manipulate elements and to create things and alchemize things, whether in the spiritual realm or in the 3D, the third dimension that we live in now, right? And so when we consider these traits and we consider the roles that these women held, and you have to wonder why were they so regarded and held to high regard in ancient times, and then now they're seen as outcasted. These women literally went from being praised and protected within the realms of kingdoms to being burned at the stake, being executed and exiled from their communities. What happened? But thousands of years ago, all women were believed to have some type of sacred knowledge. And the reason for this is because people in tribes, remember, the world was a lot less populated and people lived in closer proximity. And as a woman, something that happens when we are in the presence of other women, we tend to sync up to their cycles, their monthly menstrual cycle. We sync up. So the people in the villages noticed that the women would all sync up and bleed at the same time, and this was seen as a divine encounter. This was seen as a phenomena. Many anthropologists have discovered caves today where there are vulva shaped openings in caves that they've painted red to honor and pay homage to the menstrual cycle that women had monthly. What's very interesting is that long ago, thousands of years ago, the moon was actually a lot closer to the earth. Fun fact, our moon is moving away from the earth at a rate of about 2.5 inches per year. So you can imagine that thousands of years ago, how much closer it was. And in the same way that the moon affects the tide of our ocean, right? We have that tidal pull. we were much more connected to the earth, to our planet, and to its luminary, which is the moon at that time. So the women would menstruate on, I believe it was the full moon. I believe it was the full moon, and then they would ovulate on the new moon, or it might be the other way around. But their cycles synced up with the moon. And if you think about it, we have a monthly cycle that is 28 days, and the lunar cycle is 28 days as well. And so it synced up perfectly. In tribal times, they believed that women had a connection to the moon. And so, if women's bodies are syncing up to the same exact 28-day cycle as the moon, obviously those women must have some type of connection, right? And so they drew that parallel. If you think back in Egypt, the priestesses were believed to have some type of sacred knowledge. The priestesses worked with different elements. You know, they worked with frankincense and rose when they could have it. Um, then you look at ancient Mesopotamia, you look at Uruk, you look at so many different things, so many different places, even in the ancient Mayan culture, women were always viewed as having some type of connection to the earth. Then we get to medieval Europe. And that was a dark time for Europe. Okay. This was a time where the patriarchy was just starting to, it was kind of in its incipience, it was in its beginning time. And there were medical doctors, but there were very few who were designated and certified into practicing. And so they relied heavily on midwifery, which are, you think about it, midwives, nurse midwives is what we would call them today. And so these women who were engaged in midwifery, they were skilled at harvesting herbs and using them for ailments. So they would create ointments out of, out of mandrake plants, and they would use rosemary and thyme and mugwort to heal things and to create cheaper options for those who did not have access to medical care. These women were highly protected and highly regarded until they weren't. There was a revolution, a religious revolution that happened in the medieval times. And this religious revolution began to see individuals who were skilled at practicing midwifery or things with the earth. They started to be seen as casting spells. And so these midwives or nurses went from being praised and delivering children into the arms of their mothers to anytime there was a miscarriage or a death during labor, on the mother dying during labor, which happened quite often. Childbearing back in those times was not a safe thing to do. It was not safe the way that it is now. Many women and many babies did not make it through the childbearing process. And so, who did the religious people, who did the church officials blame? They blamed the midwives, and they accused them of being quote unquote witches. Now, we have to consider what is the origin of the word witch. That comes from Wicca, or Wiche, I believe, which means wise woman. And they were considered wise women because they worked with the herbs and they were skilled at things that really didn't have a name. Like it's like it didn't, they couldn't really understand. It was something kind of unseen. It wasn't the scientific um, theories or formulas that the doctors had practiced. It wasn't, um, you know, mathematical calculations that some other people would practice. But for some reason, these women were so wise and so dependent upon their intuition, and still it worked, that it created a threat to those individuals. And so anytime something went wrong during a childbirth or a delivery, these women were blamed. The midwives, the nurse midwives, were blamed, and they were exiled. Now this picked up, and I'm going very quickly, but this picked up quite a bit. If you're interested in learning more about this specific history, I do recommend this book here. This is called Witches of the Atlantic World. And I know it looks kind of scary because you see the green man on here. Don't be afraid. This is you see the goat man on here. This is not something to be afraid of. This is literally just a history book, okay? It's not a grimoire. It's not going to come haunt you, okay? It is a history book, and it talks about specifically um, the Malleus Maleficarum, right? The Malleus Maleficarum was a document that was published in medieval Europe, where I cannot remember the guys' names. Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer. These were their names. And what they did was they created a criteria where women would fall under and they would be considered witches. So is she what we would call today? Is she PMSing? Is she acting hysterical during her monthly cycle? Then she's a witch. If she's having intercourse with the man and the man releases too soon, then she's a witch and she put a spell on him. Or if her man cannot bring her to climax, then she's a witch. Women got accused of everything. Women got blamed for everything. It reminds me of the story of the Adam and Eve, okay? It brings me back to the Garden of Eden, where Eve got blamed for everything. We blame Eve for everything that happened. Anyway, so Hamer and Springer's Malleus Maleficarum was published in 1486. Um, and one of the chapters in it is why women are chiefly addicted to evil superstitions. So, what this book did, it is like the ultimate red pill. Like, if you want to look at what red pill was in like the medieval times, the Malleus Maleficarum, also known as the Hammer of Witches, because it's what they used to throw the hammer on women at the time, um, is like the ultimate red pill take. Okay. If a woman was not a virgin, if a woman made a man excited and he didn't want to be excited, then she was casting a spell on him, and she was liable to be burned, or tortured or murdered, and that's just what it was. Another one is the devil, the body, and the feminine soul. um yeah, I mean, there's just so much. There's so much in this book. It's actually very good. They talk about people being accused of uh so much in here. But anyway, if you want more of a history lesson, I definitely recommend checking this. So the rise of the patriarchy and religion is what caused these women to be exiled and murdered and executed out of their homes. They weren't allowed to own property. They were manipulated by their government. They were killed by their government. They were stolen from by their government. They were oppressed by their government. Does that sound familiar? It's all because their powers were unseen and misunderstood. And many of the women, realistically, they banded together against the patriarchy. They knew what was happening to them was not fair, and so they quote unquote rebelled. They were considered unruly. They were considered unjust, and therefore exiled. They were exploited. They were embarrassed. They were executed. And we cannot forget about how women who were brought over here on ships against their will, men and women were brought on their ships against their will and brought to America to be slaves, had their religion, their West African Yoruba faith beaten out of them because they believed in a separate God. They believed in a different God. And so these women who were priestesses and sages and oracles, they had their religion and their spirituality beaten out of them as well. In South America, and in modern day Dominican Republic, which was then known as Hispaniola, they used to have these things called auto de fes. And auto de fes were used to uh, they were a humiliation ritual that the Christians and the Catholic Church did to people who were of the African faith or the Taino people. They beat their own native beliefs out of them, their practices, their cultural beliefs. And so that image of voodoo priestesses and witches in Salem, and all of this has stuck with us as a culture, as a history for hundreds of years. Now women are starting to become more accepting of their title of the witch. Women are embracing their rebellion, and I think a lot of that has to do with the feminist movement that's been going on. There's been a rise also in new age studies, which I think has empowered and opened doors for women to embrace that other side, more that occult side of them as well. Men and women, I say women, but I mean men and women. And I think this is a response to centuries of being repressed, right? This rebellion, or this trend of people accepting the title of witchcraft. I think now the archetype of the witch is starting to be associated with depth, with creativity, with divinity in some ways. There's almost this quiet power, and of course there's a stigma associated with it that could be like, darkness. But and that's the stigma that I had. I've always associated witchcraft with like evil and everything. But I just think this is super interesting. Okay, so I want to close this video out by talking about symbolism. You know that we like to do symbolism. So the symbolism of the witch archetype, the broom symbolizes cleansing, protection, and boundary setting. Okay. The cauldron symbolizes creation, transformation, the womb. And I want to add in the four elements, because when we think about the tarot and the cauldron, we have the magician, who is the master of all four elements. So the cauldron is the four elements: earth, air, fire, water. Creation, transformation, the womb, alchemizing again. The moon is intuition, cycles, feminine rhythm. The ether, or the familiar, things like cats, ravens, the two birds that were out here. I don't know if those were ravens or hawks. They were huge. They were like this big, these birds, just one after the other, just circling around my window. Um, Things embodied in nature. So I hope I taught you something a little bit about the witch and how they've taken away the witch's power and that kind of thing. Um, and a little bit about the history of it. I'm probably going to do a full on series. This is just kind of a precursor, but I hope that you liked it. I hope that you got something out of it, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye.